So here we are. We're here to talk about how do we get the next 10 years right. And I don't think we can start without mentioning, as Charlie and Tabitha have said, the Black Lives Matter protests that are happening around the world. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, a riot is the language of the unheard. And sometimes society has to reach a breaking point before real change can take root. I sincerely hope the time for change is now. These are incredibly challenging times, unprecedented in our lifetimes, and we are just over 5 months into this decade. As the pandemic raged through our communities and lockdowns were enforced, the entire global economy came to a standstill. And what followed was a profound economic shock, which is still reverberating now. But that shock also exposed deep inequalities in our society and how we care for our citizens. But through all these challenges, we witnessed the best of humanity shining through. And that gives me hope that as we start the recovery process, we can genuinely unify and bring communities together. If we're going to get the next 10 years right, we need leaders with empathy who care about their fellow citizens and are prepared to work to end injustice and create opportunities for everyone. Which brings me to the class of 2020. Those marvelous young minds graduating this month from our great institutions of higher learning. There are no ceremonies, no celebrations for them, and very few jobs are waiting. But they are optimistic and more determined than ever, and I admire them. And I believe that we should do everything in our power to help them achieve their dreams and become the generation that guides us to a fairer society and a healthier planet. Young activists like Greta Thunberg, who found her voice and with courage and conviction demanded the world pay attention to the threats of the climate crisis on the horizon. Or the students from Parkland, Florida, who bravely stood up to an entrenched US gun lobby to fight for their murdered classmates. There are millions of young adults around the world just like them, committed to solving the significant issues we face as a society, and their voices must be heard. Today, we have global communication platforms that connect us to over 3 billion people. Hugh, if you could advance the slide. Thank you. Theoretically speaking, nearly half the world's population can talk to one another, but not all voices are being heard. The ownership of these platforms is concentrated in the hands of a few, which should be deeply concerning in societies that cherish freedom of expression. But let's put that aside for a moment. These companies have a truth problem. They pander to the powerful, they fear regulation and retribution, and they turn a blind eye to those who are spreading vile conspiracy theories. The messages that get the most likes and shares are often linked to fake accounts that spread misinformation and normalize hateful narratives. And it turns out that the algorithms that maximize monetization are also quite effective at amplifying division and inciting violence. The leadership of these companies must help truth find its voice. It's time they live up to their ideals and show that their standards mean something. If we are going to get things right in this decade, the global communication platforms that link us all together need to become what they were originally intended for, places where we can engage in substantive dialogue about real issues facing our world, and where everyone's voice can be heard. Though technology propels us in so many ways forward, it's not a surrogate for society. We cannot abdicate our responsibilities. Civility, equality, and public discourse should not be determined or manipulated by technology. We, the people, not the state, and indeed not the internet platforms, are responsible for our own destiny. And we must constructively engage and define what is valuable to us and what future we want to build for our children. And let's remember that an iPad or a smartphone is not a substitute for parenting. And I am not being judgmental. We have all been there, but our children need us to be present now more than ever. If you could go to the next slide. While we are on the subject of truth, an alarming fact that you may not be aware of is that while the world has been locked down, child abuse and online sexual exploitation has exploded. And yet internet platforms, device manufacturers, pander to the nihilistic entitlement of the abusers with platitudes to protect their privacy, further enabling them to obfuscate their crimes. We need to fight back and ensure the internet is safe for all children, to learn, to dream, to communicate, to be inspired. That is the mission of the We Protect Global Alliance, an organization I founded. We believe that technology in and of itself is neither good nor evil. It's up to us to make it a powerful ally and to use its transformative power to heal and stop this heinous crime. What we experienced in the last few months brings home my next point. If you could change the slide. We have never been more aware of the fragility of human life. All human beings deserve to be healthy. It's a fundamental human right. Over the past few months, we've watched daily news recount the number of souls who have lost their lives to COVID-19. And what's transpired forced us to recognize deep inequalities in our society. We learned that the chance of catching the virus was much higher for the everyday heroes whose jobs require interaction with the public or taking care of others in hospitals and care homes. We are forever grateful to their bravery and kindness. We also learned that our ability to fight the disease is often correlated to the economic circumstances of the patient and whether they have access to quality health care or if they take medicines to treat comorbidities common among ethnic and disadvantaged groups. This pandemic has laid bare inequalities in our society, and we can no longer ignore them. So why can't we just build a world where no disease goes untreated? Well, I believe that we can, but that world will not naturally emerge. We must actively create it. Today, thousands of diseases have no treatment, and yet we spend tens of billions each year supporting a broken system that leaves millions of patients without hope for a cure. This has to change. Patients deserve better. We must leverage breakthrough technologies and make the best use of the world's vast and ever-expanding universe of biomedical information for the benefit of all. If you could change the slide, please. At BenevolentAI, our team is mission-driven to preserve human life, and I'm immensely proud of the work that we do. But the technology we build is just a spark. By augmenting human intelligence, our AI and machine learning tools empower scientists to discover life-changing medicines. And when faced with the escalating global pandemic, we turned our AI and drug discovery platform toward identifying existing drugs that could be used to treat COVID-19 until a vaccine is developed. Our platform identified a treatment that has both antiviral and anti-cytokine properties, which has now entered randomized clinical trials in the United States and around the world. This experience has reinforced our belief that innovative thinking combined with purposeful technology can truly lead to better outcomes for patients, which brings me to my final point. To get the next decade right, if you could change the slide. To get the next decade right, technology needs to start working for us, not the other way around. We need to stop believing that tech is imbued with some kind of superpower that one day will democratize benefits for everyone. 30 years into this internet revolution, and that still hasn't happened. And simply wishing for it isn't going to make it so. It's time to recognize the real political and economic forces at play and demand a future that serves us all. And the message for the tech industry and governments: we must ensure that the AI we are building is magnanimous, not malevolent, that bias is kept in check, and that the future serves us all equally. The diversity of data we use to power our AI and machine learning must represent society as a whole so that no one is left behind. But let's remember, it's always darkest before the dawn. Throughout modern history, when things seemed most desperate, leaders emerged to raise society. And today, leadership is not who is prime minister or president. It's about all of us caring for each other and finding our voices and defining a clear path for the future. We have just 3 days together at the virtual CogX. Let's make the best use of it to the fullest extent. Let's unite behind concrete ideas and spark change so that the recovery can begin and we can get back onto the path of progress. And yes, let's get the next 10 years right so that we can have a society for the next 1,000 years.
Thank you, Joanna. That was a wonderful presentation, and you touched on a lot of different topics there, and I'd love to come back and go a little bit deeper into what you're doing at BenevolentAI right now and what contribution that could make. I'm going to move on to our second panelist, Leif Johansson. You have an extraordinary position in this complicated world right now as chairman of AstraZeneca. How would you address the question, how do we get the next 10 years right?
Well, first of all, I'm basically in physics and engineering, but I have been in industry my whole life. I've never spent time in politics, and therefore I have lots of opinions, but more so coming from an industrial base than from a political base. I've been working with many different products, mobile radio phone stations, trucks, AstraZeneca, Bristol Myers Squibb, and about 25 years in the pharmaceutical industry, and now with AstraZeneca. I think I'd like to describe myself and an attitude towards what we're doing as an optimistic one, as an optimist. But I often say that I'm more optimistic on science and technology than most. But above all, I've learned over the past decades, dealing with different issues around the world, including strategic issues at companies I've been involved with, that you need to be an activist optimist. There is a dangerous side of optimism that makes you lean back and say everything will cure itself. And it's not going to. It's going to if we can apply science and technology in an activist way, in such a way that we make substantial change for the world. That has spread into my view on what corporations should be doing. Corporations should be part of the societies in which they work. And we should be seen in general as companies that are dynamically contributing to a build-up of positive impact on our world. Now, at AstraZeneca, that translates into making innovative medicines for 3 therapeutic areas: oncology, respiratory, and cardiovascular metabolic disease. And as you will see, and I'll be saying a few words about, that is also taking us into a very good cooperation with the Jenner Institute of Oxford on vaccines. But we feel that we can contribute by creating a healthier society, like Joanna was saying before. And it's also interesting to note that while that is often a debate, whether that's what companies should be doing, should they not only be making money, I think it's fair to say that the stock market has reacted very positively to what we have done at AstraZeneca, doubling the rate of R&D to sales, etc. So much so that we are at the top of the FTSE 100 evaluations now. So how can we contribute now? Obviously, we have an opportunity to work in pre-infection stages, and vaccines is a real issue. Jenner Institute in Oxford have a tremendous knowledge and academic awareness of what goes on in vaccines. And we have been able to partner with them in such a way that we actually have now developed a at-risk, because these are always products that need to be approved by regulatory authorities. But at risk, we have developed a capacity of 2 billion doses. And we have just recently made agreements, both with the US and the UK, but also with CEPI and Gavi to spread those vaccines equitably if they work around the world in a positive way. So I think that's a good, wonderful example of how you, in an activist way, can use our resources of commercialization together with academia and for that matter, other industry. We have also offered our testing capacity in the UK. So about 1/3 of testing that was on in the US goes through our labs. Post-infection, there is also good news in the sense that There's about 20 different attempts to try to find treatments for the infection. We have one of those at the last stage when you're really seriously ill. We are trying to find ways to deal with what is called cytokine shock. The good thing is that when we add the efforts up of all of the different companies, academia, etc., that looks at treatment of infection, and typically with already approved medicines, we could see a disease that actually halves in mortality compared to where we are now. So if you combine the efforts of, say, potential vaccines coming towards the end of the year, yet to be seen, and then all of these different treatment options that could halve the mortality of the disease, then we have a completely new setup that we can address. So longer term then, what can we do to really create a much better world to live in? From our point of view, and let me again say background, of course, in technology and digitalization, if you look at the enormous computing power that we can have in cloud, then we have communication very inexpensively, almost at no cost. And then we can also store in the cloud very easily. If you look at what you can do that in science and R&D, then you can say, if you think about the new biological molecules that we are now producing and making medicines of, 250,000 atoms per molecule. We need to be able to find, see what the aspects of those are, and we need to be able to sort them out in different categories of products. All of that, of course, lends itself fantastically to the type of computing power that we have available and the communication that we have. Let me say that's when we make medicines. I think we can also be very optimistic, but we need to work a lot in developing innovative healthcare systems. And typically healthcare systems around the world are built in physical structures, hospitals, clinics, etc. We have the opportunity now with technology to build a virtual infrastructure that will really be productive, much safer, and will be, from a society point of view, at much less cost than what we are operating systems at. So take the physical infrastructure of hospitals, imagine hospitals, and then take the virtual infrastructure of, imagine telemedicine or remote monitoring of different diseases. There, I think you have much of the future. And let me just finally say that on carbon dioxide, I believe we have a real issue. I've been in many industries. I'm now in the pharmaceutical industry. AstraZeneca has undertaken to be zero carbon by 2025 in our own operations, and by 2030 in our whole supply chain around the world. That can be done. We have a wonderful, very energy efficient site, for example, at Cambridge. That can be done, but again, requires lots of effort, lots of technology, lots of science, lots of optimism. Thank you.
Thank you, Leif. I mean, the work you're doing there is quite extraordinary, and we should come back and talk about that in particular, especially this idea of how we can create a hybrid between the digital and the traditional ways of running the health system and delivering care. Thank you for that. Our third panelist this morning is going to be Sharmadean Reid, who's an extraordinary young entrepreneur and has a business called Beautystack. But Sharma, it'd be great if you could share with us your thoughts on this big question: how do we get the next 10 years right?
Thank you, Charlie. For me, these next 10 years are really about accepting that gender and racial inequalities are still alive and well, and accepting it and thinking about how to make a change. For me, until there are more women and minorities in positions of power in all strata of society, nothing's going to change. Because even now you see that in science, in politics, business, military and policing, as the numbers have shown lately, finance, the inequity starts from the top and trickles down, and it just creates the social inequality that lead to the events we see today with the Black Lives Matter movement. for me, there really needs to be systemic change to address these imbalances, because they're the things that are destroying the progress of our society. And, you know, the last few weeks have made me really, really think about how I don't want to live in a world that continues like the last decade has. It feels like something's got to give. So how do we make that happen? Is positive discrimination for me is one step. But the way I like to explain it is that merely inviting us to have a seat at the table is not enough. Because when you invite a woman or a minority to have a seat at the table, you have to understand that we haven't had a lifetime of preparation. That means we know which knife and fork to use, how to order the wine, and what the correct amount of tip is. We weren't taught that from the day that we were born. So to me, equal representation is not the same as equal opportunity. I think it has to be understood that when you advocate for a woman or a minority and support them in positions of power, it will need to come with an understanding, education, and a support network to combat the setbacks they've had since the day that they were born. Because these setbacks, whether they're emotional, emotional trauma, or they're more tangible, such as lower pay, they compound over time. You know, anyone can do the math on that. So for me, in my industry, which is technology and startups, I've gotten over the first hurdle. There's a lot of data around the fact that 98% of VCs are white men. And then there's more data that shows that Black female founders receive just 0.2% of all VC funding, which is crazy. So, you might look at me and be like, oh, cool, you've gotten over the first hurdle, because I am one of the few, if not the only Black woman I know of that has received institutional venture funding. So, I've raised over £5 million from two incredible and supportive funds for my startup. Beautystack's a social marketplace that economically empowers women. But the thing is my journey is a complete anomaly. Like, you have to know that I'm a weirdo and I'm an outlier, and you shouldn't look up at me on this stage and say, well, she's managed to do it, why can't everyone do it? Because it's simply not true. I got over the first hurdle and I raised the money, but what I've learned now is that, am I going to deploy that capital as efficiently? I have no technology background, no finance background. I don't come from a private school network, so I don't have access to the best talent, the best mentors. I don't hang out in the spaces whereby these deals are done to help me win at this startup life. So there's been quite a lot of new funds promising to back founders of colour, but it's not just money that we need, it's sponsorship, mentors and advocates. So how can you guys help today? I've done a whole Twitter thread on this, but the core things is to make a warm introduction to a female or a minority person in your peer group. It might be in healthcare, in the food industry, in finance, whatever it is. Bring them up and bring them into your crew. Have open office hours to share your wisdom. And the most important part that I'm sure that you guys understand in your industry is that apprenticeship and showing people the ropes and how the processes work and how to do things is half the battle. So consider taking on an apprenticeship. When you help women and minorities rise to the top, you get more products, more processes and policies that consider all of society. So the final thing I would say on this is stop trying to make marginalized communities bend to institutional and systemic rules. You have to make new rules. You have to update your policies. You have to change your systems, because everyone in this room can acknowledge that I live in a world that was not designed for me. So let's shift those numbers at the top and change that. That's how I want to see the world change. Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you, Sharma. That was fantastic, and you're very articulate on all three of those points, and we should come back to all of them if we have time in the panel before we wrap up. But thank you for that. We're going to move to our fourth panelist. And so, Angela, if you could join me now. Oh, there we are.
Charlie, hello.
There. Hi, Angela. Welcome. Yes, obviously, you've had a pretty unique point of view over the last few months, and really keen to understand, having gone through that, no doubt, extraordinarily intense and urgent situation. How would you, and what would you take from that in answering this question about the next 10 years?
Thank you very much, Charlie. And thank you very much for the invitation to be here. So I'm an academic infectious disease epidemiologist, but back in September, I joined government, and I really was expecting to do something different from infectious disease epidemiology for a few years, but how wrong I was. And I wanted to talk about the last couple of months, actually, bookended by two dates. One is the 2nd of April, and one is the 3rd of June. The 2nd of April, I remember, because my favourite play was being put on telly. But it was also 10 days after March the 23rd, when the country had gone into lockdown, and the number of cases admitted to hospital of COVID-19 was still rising. So I was driving my family nuts trying to watch that telly show, because I kept getting up and walking out the room and sending text messages to people. It was a really, really anxious time. And when I went to bed, I couldn't sleep either. The other thing that was going on was that, as well as the cases had still risen that day, was that the number of people who had died, sadly, was already worse that day than in this thing we built called the reasonable worst case scenario. And that's not supposed to happen. So at 3 o'clock, you can imagine, at 3 o'clock in the morning, I wasn't asleep. And so I got up and I sort of composed an email to some colleagues about, you know, do we need to make a new scenario? What are we going to do? And straight away, like that, I got 5 responses back. I wasn't the only one who was awake that night. And although it was a really sort of anxious time, there was this sense that it wasn't just me, that there were loads and loads of people in all sorts of different walks of life worrying together and working together. Now, my second date, June the 3rd, is a much happier one. So this was last week. And I was on a meeting a bit like this, and an email pinged in saying that this very important study called the Office of National Statistics Community Study had, for the first time, taken swabs from enough people over the month of May that we could see that the number of infections in the community was actually falling. And I ripped off my earphones and went and danced in the kitchen. I was so excited. And actually, I'm astonished that that statistic doesn't get more attention, because it is the actual measured amount of new infection out in the community. And for the first time, we actually really know that is falling. And it's falling, actually, it's falling faster than admissions to hospital, which is also very good news. So for me, this has been a really intense time of watching numbers. First, numbers that rose, and more recently, numbers that have been falling. And one of the questions you asked me is, what 3 things would you change? And so one of the things I would change would be to try to make sure that everybody was really, really happy and thinking about numbers the way my community does. So just completely at ease with thinking about half-lives and growth rates and what they actually mean in terms of what's happening in a community. And of course, there are other narratives here too. Numbers isn't the only thing. And perhaps most starkly, the other narrative here with COVID is the narrative of inequality. And as Joanna and Shar have already noted, this pandemic has absolutely laid bare profound differences in the lives that people lead. And those differences mean that in this country, Black and minority ethnic populations are more likely to be tested, they're more likely to test positive, they're more likely to be hospitalised, and they're more likely to die from COVID. And then the third thing I feel I've learned in those just 2 short months is the incredible power of kindness. We've been working really, really hard together, as have many, many people I know in response to this pandemic. And these are groups of people who are quite often actually in normal life in competition with each other. But there's been this very collaborative, urgent sense of needing to do things together. And I think one of the things that I've seen is just the enormous leadership quality or kindness. Jumping now to 10 years, I'm going to jump over the 12 months. I think the thing I'm really hoping that we're going to see in the next 10 years is the democratization of data and analytics. So I've been really, really struck by, on the one hand, how well things have gone when we've had good data streams about what's happening, and how badly they've gone when we haven't been able to get our hands on the data properly, or sometimes the data isn't quite what we thought it was. I'm going to stop there because I promised Bryony I'd leave her fair share of time. But I do just want to reiterate, for me, the three things are education, particularly maths education, equality, particularly around exposure that we've seen, exposure to infection and other ill health, and kindness as a really important leadership quality for the next 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. I think that's just a really wonderful note to finish on around kindness, and brings a very different dimension to the conversation. We're going to go to our fifth panelist, Bryony. You've spent a huge part of your career trying to work to get the climate crisis under control, and it's wonderful to have you here. And I can't think of a more important topic to end these 5 introductions. So please, over to you.
Thank you, Charlie, and congratulations for getting this under sail. It's really exciting to be part of it, and I know it's been a huge labour of love over the last weeks and months, so congratulations to all of your team. Yeah, I'm sort of going to say a few comments about climate change, but I'm really delighted actually that CogX has added the planet stage to its lineup this year. And climate change is such a vast topic. There's no way that I can say anything that's going to do it justice in these few minutes. But I would encourage people to tune into various sessions that are coming up later today. And perhaps one theme that I'd like to just touch on in relation to climate change is where technology and the digital revolution intersects with the challenge of climate change. And if you have one talk that you should perhaps, I think, make time to go and see, which is not going to be specifically about climate change, but is really important, is Shoshana Zuboff's talk on the leadership stage on day 3. I think it's at 3:30. And the reason I say that is because it was reading her book where I realized that there are so many new tools now being deployed that are being used to shift our views, to change our hearts and minds, sell us things, influence our behavior, but we're not harnessing anywhere near enough of them to solve the greatest risk we face in the long run, which is climate change. And you could say the same about many other social issues that need to be changed. Because from my perspective, and I should say I've been working on climate change for 20 years in various roles. At the moment, I have 2 hats, one in the House of Lords, where I'm a policy, a regulator and an overseer of legislation. And then I'm also the co-director of a foundation where we're dispersing money to try and help trigger change through philanthropic grant making. And so for the next 10 years for us, we're hoping to commit around about $100 million a year for 10 years. We've got to make sure we try and leverage that expenditure to trigger systemic change. And for me, I come at this from the perspective of an accidental politician in the House of Lords. There are so many headwinds that we face in trying to force change. It's a complex, wicked problem from a political point of view. The reason it's complex and hard is because there are 3 tragedies. Tragedy of the commons, which is no single nation, certainly no individual can solve it alone. It needs everyone to act together. There's a tragedy of the horizon, meaning that this is a long-term systemic risk. It's an existential risk that's going to play out over decades. And yet we're needing to act now to make sure we take the right path to enable society to flourish and to have the life that we've come to enjoy continue. And it's very hard to act now because it will cost more in the short term quite often. And the third tragedy is that this is not a level playing field. We have the tragedy of the incumbents, which is that there are numerous entities here who want to protect the status quo, and we see that all the way through on lobbying and preventing us to move forward. So it's wicked and hard. So we need every tool in the toolbox to try and unify people, bring them together and apply pressure so that we see that systemic change, whether that's through multilateral treaties or national policies or corporates taking action and properly doing the right thing by investing in the future. the tools that are out there, I group them together and say, you know, there's surveillance activism that we've got surveillance capitalism on the one hand, but surveillance activism needs to be defined and funded and supported. We need to use all of that knowledge we have. We know more about what people are thinking than we ever have done before. And knowing that, with that insight, we should be able to raise an army and call for change and apply the pressure at the right point so that we get the right decisions and we get trillions of dollars flowing into the solutions that we know are out there. Because ultimately, this shouldn't be seen as a problem of stopping doing things. This is a massive challenge in making money flow to doing the right things. It's hugely exciting. Many of your speakers who will be speaking over the next 3 days will touch themes. I want people to feel energized. I want people to feel that they have insights and tools that they can deploy to this problem. And let's make the next decade a decade of surveillance activism, and let's solve these problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Bryony. I love that concept of surveillance activism. I've actually not heard of it before. Is that something that you have introduced, or is that?
Well, I think I've stolen it from Shoshana, yes. But yeah, it was reading a book that made me think we need to do it.
That's great. Thank you. If we could bring the whole panel on. Now, I did suspect that with such an incredible panel of contributors, we were going to run up against the clock. And Tabitha and I have a tradition of trying to make sure that we do stick to time. So we've only got a very short period left for some comments. But Leif, I'd love to come back to you and just ask you, when you hear that breadth of input and contribution, and obviously what you had to say, you know, what concrete actions do you think we could all take today in our own individual lives to really make a difference?
I think it actually depends very much on industry and even country. But it's, to me, very clear that every time you have a reflex to sort of isolate yourself, go back into your country or your company or in your own comfort zone, think differently and try to connect to the outside world. There's so many talents around the world that we can act together with. And I think this idea that we can sort of separate and come into our comfort zone is no longer an option for the world. So think differently, come out of the comfort zones.
Thank you. And Joanna, how would you add to that as we bring the panel to a close?
Yeah, I think it was Shar who said that her generation is making new rules, and that they're not going to bend our rules to make it work for them, because our society is set up, you know, in the old way. And I think that's a really key message here. The young people, the Generation Z, we need to really support them. But their ideas, they're going to be on this planet a lot longer than us, and their ideas are going to be fresh and new. So we just need to guide and support them with our life experience, but let their ideas flourish, because I think they're going to come up with better solutions than we have.
Very good. And of course, this year, for the first time, we have a Gen Z stage. And I can't wait to see some of the sessions there. Just jumping back to you, Angela, I loved your thought around kindness. I mean, it can't get more fundamental than that. Is there anything else you wanted to add on reflection from everybody else's talks?
I thought it was very interesting how actually quite often the same ideas came out. So these ideas about the democratization of data, about how we do have a new set of incredibly powerful tools, and we need to move ourselves to a position where they are accessible to everybody, so that everybody would expect to be able to sort of formulate their own question. I was imagining what would a map of government look like? And, you know, why don't we have those things? And why can't everybody go in just the same way that, you know, you'd expect to be able to see a physical map of where you live? And I think those things are coming and will be empowering in the same way that the Ordnance Survey maps are incredibly empowering.
So it's a message around education that's coming through, collaboration and education. And Sharma, you talked about education and how we, you know, bring, and what democratize is a very broad word, but to make sure that the same education, the same opportunities are available. Obviously, you've managed to break through What do we need to do to continue and develop that further?
I think when it comes to education, it's not just like the formalized how to do this, how you'd write a pitch deck. I think teaching young people critical thinking is absolutely important, critical thinking and problem solving, because then they can be collaborative, as Angela was saying, or they can be kind, or they can have a point of view whereby, as Joanna said, technology is not the be all and end all. We need to challenge the way things have been done for the last 200 or 2,000 years and make new rules, and you need problem solvers to do that.
That's great. In fact, there was a quote I heard recently from Muhammad Yunus, who said, yeah, we need to stop teaching people to get jobs and teach them to solve problems. And I think that really is an interesting point of view. Stop teaching them how to get a job and teach people how to solve problems and ultimately be entrepreneurs. Now, Bryony, I don't know if we've still got you here. Have we lost you? Okay, I was going to wrap up with one last comment about what we can all do to contribute to addressing the climate challenge. But maybe if anybody wants to comment on that, Leif, should we throw it back to you? I know in your time at Volvo, you would have been very, very involved in this conversation too. But what can we all be doing today to make a mark on the climate challenge?
Well, I think first of all, we can arrange conferences like these without flying into specific venues. So I think we have learned just over the past 6 months, I have learned dramatically much more how to be more carbon efficient in my own travel and the way I work. We can buy electrical cars. We can make very energy efficient buildings. I would argue that we should, every time we have a new building, we should build at the absolute highest standards of energy, which would involve heat pumps and things like that. So there's lots and lots and lots of things to do. We have looked at really get the complete supply chain to review and see what it really does, and then see how we can actually make it different. I think, again, this crisis over the last 6 months have taught us a lot about the depth and diversity of supply chains that potentially could be simplified and therefore also much more carbon effective. So lots of things to do.
Great. Well, that's a great note to earn on. We've got clearly lots of incredible panels to come, but this was a fantastic kickoff to CogX 2020. I just want to thank all of our panelists, Leif, Joanna, Sharma, Angela, Bryony, for making your time available. I know you're all extremely busy, and I hope you get to enjoy some of the rest of the conference as well.
Thank you so
Very
much.
good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.